You need to learn how to respect the homeowner, my daughter Isabella said, coldly, just as I sat down at the dining table with my right arm in a cast. Amidst the crowd of guests, Robert Maxwell, my son-in-law, had invited to celebrate his imminent sale of the apartment, Isabella's words cut like a knife into a fresh wound. I looked at Robert. He smirked, his eyes full of contempt and triumph. My right arm still ached from the shove last night.
But physical pain was nothing compared to the coldness in my daughter's eyes. She, the one I had dedicated my entire life to loving, now sided with the man who had ruined me, turning me into a homeless person in my own home. The room held its breath, not out of pity, but out of curiosity. Blood rushed to my head, but my body was paralyzed, unable to fight back. This humiliation was worse than death. I swallowed my tears, looking up at Robert, then Isabella. My gaze was no longer one of pain, but of ultimate coldness. Fine, if that's what you want. I'll give it to you, I thought to myself. The plan had begun. Have you ever had your own daughter and son-in-law strip you of your assets, pushing you to the brink? If it were you, what would you do? What state are you living in? Subscribe now. This apartment is too big, Cecilia, he once said, his voice deceptively soft, as I meticulously watered my prized orchids. Charlotte and I could make much better use of this space. You know you're old. You don't need so much room. The words, delivered with a casual air, sliced through me with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, though I was the one bleeding internally. I merely smiled, a practiced mask, trying to suppress the nausea that churned in my stomach. Charlotte, my own daughter, sat nearby in Arthur's beloved armchair, her eyes glued to her phone screen, utterly silent. Her silence, I realized, was a deeper, more chilling betrayal than any of Damien's thinly veiled insults. It wasn't just agreement mingled with the metallic tang of betrayal. I understood I was no longer just a resident here. I was a target. What happens when your own flesh and blood turns against you, and the sanctuary you built becomes your prison? My Upper West Side apartment, a sanctuary overlooking Central Park, once hummed with the quiet rhythm of retired life. After decades as a cardiovascular surgeon, saving lives and navigating complex human hearts, I found solace in my home's predictable elegance. Every antique, every book, every framed photo of my late husband Arthur and our daughter Charlotte held a story, a whisper of a life well-lived. This was my refuge, built on memories and love. Then Charlotte and Damien Stone moved in. It began subtly, an offer to help out after my knee surgery, a temporary stay that stretched into weeks, then months. Damien, my son-in-law, a man I had always found overtly ambitious, now filled the quiet spaces with his booming voice and unsettling gaze, appraising every object, every corner of my home, as if calculating their worth. He often lingered in my study, tracing Arthur's old mahogany desk, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. "This apartment is too big, Cecilia," he had said as I tended my favorite orchids. "Charlotte and I could make much better use of this space. You know you're old. You don't need so much room." His words were gentle, but their meaning cut like a knife. I merely smiled, suppressing the discomfort that swelled within me. Charlotte sat nearby, in Arthur's armchair, eyes glued to her phone, completely silent. That silence, I realized, was even more terrifying than Damien's veiled remarks. It was a sign, a cold omen. Those signs quickly escalated into Damien started moving furniture. The antique tea table Arthur had given me on our wedding day suddenly vanished from the living room, replaced by a cold, modern glass table. "The old one was outdated, Cecilia. I've updated it for you," he declared, implying a favor. I looked at Charlotte, pleading for explanation, for defense, but she merely shrugged. "Mom, Damien has good taste. He just wants everything to look better."
Her eyes were vacant, lifeless, as if she no longer recognized her own mother.
Then the words became more direct. One morning, Damien strode into the kitchen as I was brewing coffee. He placed a stack of papers on the counter, sliding them towards me. "Cecilia, we need to talk, seriously, about this apartment. You know the upkeep is enormous. Charlotte and I can manage it much better. Sign the transfer papers." He spoke, his voice a clear command. I looked at the documents, then at him. They were indeed papers for a change of ownership. He no longer hid his intentions.
"He wanted to dispossess me. Damien," I said, my voice eerily calm, "this apartment is mine. It was Arthur's in my home. It is not an item for exchange." He scoffed. "Home, Cecilia? You're living in the past. This is the future. Charlotte's future and mine." He emphasized mine with smug satisfaction.
Charlotte had entered the kitchen then, but instead of intervening, she simply leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching me as if I were a stubborn fool clinging to something worthless. My heart constricted. The pain stemmed not just from Damien's greed, but from my own daughter's cold indifference. I felt myself being pushed out little by little. The air grew heavy, suffocating, as if the apartment itself was tightening its grip. With each passing day, my apartment felt less and less like mine. Family photos were boxed away, my personal items relegated to a small corner. Even the air changed, heavy and alien. I no longer felt the warmth, the peace I had cultivated. It had transformed into a fortress where I was held captive. One afternoon, searching for Arthur's old diary in the library, I found the bookshelves completely rearranged. The books Arthur and I had cherished now lay haphazardly on the floor, making way for Damien's business documents and glossy magazines. He had usurped my library, turning it into his private office. In that moment, a cold flash ignited in my mind. Not an explosion of anger, but a sharp, chilling realization, an unyielding resolve. My hands, still trembling from an old injury, had once held a scalpel steady, saving hundreds of lives. But now I felt weak, powerless against this invasion. Or was I mistaken? I slowly picked up one of Arthur's books, dusting it off. The cover was old and worn, but the content remained intact. I clutched it tightly. This home wouldn't be taken so easily. No, Damien Stone was wrong. He thought he had won, that he could trample everything I held dear. But he didn't know that a good surgeon never gives up, especially when her own life is under threat. He had just sown a seed, and I, Cecilia Hayes, would water it with a storm. I wouldn't just protect my home, I would reclaim everything, and then some. In the days following Daniel Thorne's veiled threat, the atmosphere in my apartment grew thick and heavy, like lead. He no longer spoke directly about signing the papers, but every glance, every gesture from him was a constant reminder of his relentless intrusion. I, Cecilia Vance, tried to maintain a normal rhythm of life, as if nothing had changed. I still woke early, brewed coffee, and prepared dinner for the family, a habit ingrained in my bones for over 40 years. The kitchen, once my kingdom, where I created warm, comforting meals, now felt like a cold battlefield. Every time I held a knife, chopping vegetables, I felt Daniel's gaze from behind, heavy and calculating. One evening, as I placed a plate of honey-glazed ribs on the dining table, its aroma wasn't enough to dispel the tension in the air. Olivia, my daughter, was already in her usual seat, eyes glued to her phone screen, avoiding all eye contact. Then Daniel walked in, nonchalantly pulling out the chair at the head of the table. It was Robert's chair, my late husband's, the chair that no one in the family, not even our son, had dared to sit in since he passed away. It was a symbol, a sacred space in this home. Daniel knew that. He looked at me, a smirk revealing his blatant defiance, then sat down. He sat there imperious and possessive,
I felt a rush of heat surge to my brain, but I restrained myself. I pressed my lips together, set the plate down, trying to keep my hands from trembling. His sitting in that chair wasn't just disrespect, it was a declaration that he had completely taken over my space and my memories. I swallowed hard, the bitter taste of humiliation rising in my throat, overshadowing the sweetness of the honey. Dinner proceeded in an eerie silence.
Only the clinking of cutlery against plates and Daniel's crude chewing and swallowing broke the quiet. He ate ravenously, as if savoring his victory. Then he put his fork down and looked directly at me. "Cecilia," he began, his tone soft but laced with contempt, "don't you think it's time you started living more realistically? This apartment, it's so old, outdated, just like you." He smirked, a triumphant smile on his face. "You have no value left in keeping it, a literal burden." "You're holding back Olivia's and my future. We have big plans, ambitions that require space and finances. You can't keep clinging to things that belong to the past forever." Every word he uttered was like a dagger plunged deep into my heart. I felt my chest tighten, making it hard to breathe. No value left? Outdated? Burden? Those words echoed in my head, tearing apart every shred of dignity I had painstakingly built throughout my life. I turned to look at Olivia, my daughter. She was still there, eyes fixed on her plate, her golden hair falling to obscure her face. Not a word of protest, not a glance of defense, not a single sign of anger or empathy. Olivia's silence was more painful than any insult from Daniel. It was the deepest cut, not from words, but from the betrayal of my own flesh and blood. I had dedicated my entire life to her, sacrificed everything so Olivia could have a bright future. And now she sat there indifferently, watching me being trampled upon. In that moment, I recalled my vow as a surgeon, never give up. But now I faced the most difficult surgery, an operation to excise a part of my own life. Could I do it? I took a deep breath, trying to suppress the burning rage in my chest. I stared at Daniel, my gaze as cold as a New York winter's ice. He had crossed the line. It wasn't words. It wasn't just the house. This was about my dignity, about my very existence. He didn't just want to seize assets. He wanted to erase me from this life. A cold thought began to form deep in my mind, clear and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. I wouldn't crumble. I wouldn't become the burden he wanted. I slowly rose, without a word, leaving the unfinished meal on the table. Daniel watched me, his triumphant smile still in place. He thought he had won. He thought he had pushed me to the brink of despair. But he didn't know he had just awakened an old lioness. I walked into my bedroom, closing the door softly, making no sound. In the room's darkness, I reached out with a trembling hand to touch my wedding photo with Robert. My gaze was no longer pain, but ironclad determination. He wanted a war, then I would give him one. I wouldn't let him destroy what I had built. I had saved countless patients, brought them back from the brink of death. Now I would save myself, and I would ensure that Daniel Thorne would pay. Not just with money, but with everything he held dear. I gazed into the void, a ruthless plan slowly brewing, step by step. And it would begin tonight, right after Daniel and Olivia fell into the deep, contented sleep of victors. I smiled, a smile devoid of warmth, cold to the bone. He had dug his own grave, and I would be the one to fill it. That night, after the cold meal, where Marcus's words had cut deep into me like a knife, the tension in the apartment became thick, heavy, and suffocating.
I retreated to my room, trying to find some peace within the fragile shell I still called home. I sat by the window, looking out at the silent New York night, where city lights twinkled like invisible tears. Victoria's silence, my daughter's, hurt me more than any of Marcus's insults. It wasn't just indifference, it was a choice, an abandonment. I had spent my entire life raising her, ensuring she had the best possible life, and now I received only a cold shoulder in return. I wondered, had I misjudged him? Had a mother's love made me blind? The chair Marcus brazenly occupied at dinner haunted me. It wasn't just a chair, it was a symbol of Robert, my late husband, the soul of this house.
He hadn't just sat in it, he had sat upon the memories, the values I had cherished my entire life. A cold sensation began to creep in, not from fear, but from a brutal realization I was no longer safe in my own home. This was not where I belonged, at least not with Marcus's presence and Victoria's complicit silence. My room door suddenly burst open, tearing through the night's stillness. Marcus stood there, his greedy form etched with a barely concealed predatory desire in his eyes.
He hadn't knocked, hadn't greeted me, as if I were an object not worth his concern. "Sign it," he growled, tossing the apartment transfer papers onto my dressing table right next to my wedding photo with Robert. The pristine white paper with its dark, ominous text, like a death sentence, was brutally placed over my deceased husband's smiling face. "You're old, not lucid anymore. This apartment is a burden."
What do you need it for? He spewed vulgarities, veiled threats about me ending up in a nursing home if I didn't cooperate. His voice was shrill, echoing through the room, penetrating every cell of my body. I turned, facing him. "Never," I said, my voice strangely calm, as if I were discussing a complex surgical procedure. "This house is mine. It is my life's blood, my life's memories." Marcus sneered, a disgusting smile revealing blatant contempt. He stepped closer, his foul breath hitting my face. "Who do you think you are to defy me? You have no other choice, Eleanor. Sign it or you'll regret it." He jabbed a crude finger at the papers. I maintained an expressionless face, my eyes looking straight at him without a hint of fear. My composure seemed to infuriate him even more. He wasn't accustomed to being refused, especially by an older woman he considered weak. He was used to people bowing to his threats. But I wasn't just anyone. I was Eleanor Vance, a surgeon who had faced life and death daily, and I knew how to stand my ground. Like an animal backed into a corner, Marcus lost control. He roared, lunging forward, his crude hands gripping my shoulders tightly. A horrifying shove, I felt my body slam against the wall behind me. A dry crack echoed, followed by a searing, bone-deep pain shooting down my right arm. It was the sound of my bone breaking. I fell to the cold floor, a soft moan escaping my lips.
Intense pain spread throughout my body, but it couldn't compare to the agony of betrayal, of being humiliated in my own home. Marcus stood there looking down at me, his eyes devoid of remorse, only the gloating satisfaction of a victor. "So stubborn. Now let's see how you'll sign," he sneered, then bent down and snatched my cell phone from the table. He didn't forget to pick up the transfer papers, then turned and walked out of the room. I heard a dry click as the door was locked from the outside. I lay there in darkness and isolation, my right arm throbbing incessantly. No tears fell, but my heart felt like it was shattering into pieces. There was no more sadness, no more anger, only an ultimate coldness, a vast emptiness. I realized that I was no longer a part of this house, of this family. I had been discarded, thrown away like an old, worthless item. Marcus and Victoria thought they had won, that I had completely collapsed, accepting the fate of a useless old woman. But as he thought I was immobile, no longer capable of resistance, my left hand, trembling and aching, slowly slid toward the nightstand drawer. Inside, an old burner phone with no internet connection, only for calls and texts, had lain dormant for years, a backup plan I never thought I'd have to use. This phone was my secret, my only link to a past I had tried to bury.
My trembling left finger grazed the keypad, searching for a name that had been dormant in my memory for 20 years. A flicker of hope or a curse had just been activated. Can I trust this person again? Or will I just be walking into another trap? I don't know, but I have nothing left to lose. With my right arm in a cast, my body aching, and the room locked from the outside, I lay still on my familiar bed, feeling every throbbing beat of betrayal.
Every breath seemed to carry the bitter taste of humiliation and utter brokenness. My old burner phone resting in my left palm was the only fragile thread connecting me to the outside world, a world I thought I had abandoned long ago. I stared at the dim screen. Ethan Hayes' number appeared, like a reminder of a promise, a debt of gratitude that had lain dormant for 20 years. 20 years ago, Ethan Hayes was just an ambitious young man, a promising candidate for a state Senate seat. But then a horrific car accident almost cost him everything. I then, a leading surgeon, stood for hours in the operating room, snatching every last bit of life from the jaws of death. I vividly remember the grateful eyes of his parents, their sincere thanks, and their promise never to forget the life I saved. Ethan made a full recovery, and his career soared, from senator to the prestigious position of state governor. As for me, after many years of dedication, I chose a peaceful life, secluded in this apartment, where I believed I would enjoy my golden years with my children and grandchildren. Now, that peace was shattered, and I had to turn to a man I never thought I'd have to ask for help. A cold wave ran down my spine, not from fear, but from the bitterness of having to accept that I had become this weak. I used to be a strong, independent woman, one who always stood firm against every storm. But Robert and Isabella had stripped me, not just of my home, but also of my self-belief. They had turned me into a useless burden. No tears flowed, but my heart felt twisted. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, trying to compose myself. This was not the time for weakness. This was the time for action. I opened my eyes, looking at the phone. My left hand trembled as I pressed the call button. Each ring echoed in the quiet room like hammer blows to my soul. I didn't know if Ethan would still remember me, or if he would be willing to help an old, frail woman, abandoned by her own daughter. I had braced myself for every possibility, including rejection.
But deep inside, there was a faint glimmer of hope that the promise from all those years ago wouldn't just be empty words. "Hello, Ethan Hayes speaking." Ethan's voice over the phone was still deep and resonant, but now it carried the authority of a state governor, a man who stood at the peak of power and influence. I took a deep breath, swallowed hard, and began to speak, my voice dry but resolute. "Ethan, it's Catherine Monroe."
I don't know if you still remember me, but I was your surgeon 20 years ago. There was a brief silence on the other end, a silence that stretched on endlessly. I felt my chest tighten with anxiety. Then Ethan's voice came through, a little surprised this time, but clearly recognizing me. "Catherine, my goodness, of course I remember you. You saved my life. What's wrong, Catherine? You don't sound well." I didn't embellish, didn't complain, just stated the raw facts. I spoke of Robert Maxwell, of his greed, of how he had encroached upon my apartment little by little. I told him about Isabella, my daughter, and her terrifying silence, the indifference that had shattered my heart. Finally, I recounted the shove from last night,
my broken right arm, and how I was locked in my room, waiting for the notary to arrive and illegally transfer the apartment. I tried to keep my tone as calm as possible, not letting emotion overwhelm me, because I knew a state governor needed precise, objective information, not a sob story. Ethan listened in silence, not interrupting a single word. I could feel the tension in his every breath over the phone. When I finished, a heavy silence fell. I waited, my heart pounding. Would he believe me? Or would he think I was just a senile old woman causing trouble? Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice deeper but full of resolve, carrying the weight of authority and commitment. "Catherine," he said, "you saved my life. Now it's my turn. You said Robert Maxwell is there? And your daughter? Don't worry. I'll be there exactly at 8 p.m. tomorrow. Everything will be resolved." A jolt ran down my spine, not from fear, but from certainty.
Ethan Hayes' promise wasn't just empty words. It was a commitment, an assurance from the most powerful man in the state. The plan was set. I hung up, placing the burner phone back in its spot beneath the old cushion. I closed my eyes, a meticulous strategy already forming in my mind. Robert Maxwell and Isabella had no idea their game was about to end. They had made a fatal mistake, not only underestimating an old, frail woman, but also forgetting that I used to be a surgeon. I knew how to see through lies, how to detect hidden wounds, and more importantly, I knew how to plan with cold, precise calculation. I had sown a seed, and it would sprout at the fated moment. The pain in my right arm was still there, but the pain in my heart had been replaced by a terrifying serenity. I was ready. I, Cecilia Vance, sat at the dining table, my heavily bandaged right arm resting on my lap, kept far from everything. No food was placed before me, only a cold white porcelain plate and a glass of plain water. Robert Maxwell and Isabella had invited a few guests, unfamiliar faces I'd never met, perhaps to prove their respectability in society's eyes, or more accurately, to gloat about their impending victory. Robert sat smugly at the head of the table, the very spot where Ethan, my late husband, once presided. He ate crudely, noisily, then looked up, his small eyes gleaming with self-satisfaction. He began to boast about his upcoming plans, implicitly referring to the sale of the apartment I had spent my entire life building up. His words were like knives slicing through my flesh, but I didn't betray a single emotion. Isabella sat across from me, her gaze sweeping over me as if I were an invisible obstruction. She placed a piece of lobster onto Robert's plate, then said with an impassive face, her voice falsely sweet as she addressed the guests, "Anyway, that I had become a burden, an old, worn-out item to be discarded." Robert chuckled loudly, patting Isabella's shoulder with an approving air. He didn't know that very smile was a death sentence for his future. I looked at Robert, my gaze meeting his. There was no anger, no sorrow, only an absolute coldness, a silent message sent that he was utterly incapable of deciphering. He thought I had completely collapsed, had accepted my fate. But I knew this wasn't a victor's feast. It was a declaration of war. I didn't utter a word, letting my silence gnaw at his self-satisfaction. The room was filled with the guests' laughter and chatter, with praises for Robert and Isabella concerning their beautiful apartment and vision. Every laugh, every toast was like a hammer blow nailing shut the coffin Robert was digging for himself. I sat still, feeling every pulse of betrayal, yet simultaneously, a strange tranquility washed over me. The plan was set, and all I had to do was sit here, waiting for the moment. My bandaged arm still throbbed, but the physical pain now served as a sharp reminder of why I had to act. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming justice, reclaiming the dignity that had been stripped away. Isabella, her face radiant, stood up and raised a glass of red wine. "Let's all raise a glass to our brilliant future and to this apartment finding a more deserving owner," she said, glancing at me pointedly. The guests all raised their glasses in unison, none of them recognizing the cruelty in her words, or perhaps pretending not to. Robert stood embracing Isabella's shoulder, a triumphant smile blooming on his lips. He didn't know that very glass of wine was a toast to his own downfall. I looked at the clock on the wall. The hour hand was almost at 8. Every second, every minute that passed, carried with it Robert's inevitable collapse. He was still drunk on his own performance, utterly unaware that this play was about to have an unexpected ending. He thought he was counting down to victory, but in reality, he was counting down to his doomsday. I could feel the breath of destiny's moment drawing incredibly near. The party continued amidst an atmosphere of boisterous self-satisfaction. Robert was recounting a tedious story about a successful business deal, his tone boastful and full of pride.
Isabella sat beside him, nodding along, her eyes gleaming with calculation. They were immersed in their own illusory world, where I was merely a harmless ghost, a relic of the past that needed to be erased. I looked at my left hand, subtly gliding my finger over the burner phone, carefully hidden in my coat pocket. A message had been sent, a signal activated. Julian Hayes wasn't a man of empty words. He was a man of action, and I had absolute faith in his promise. Suddenly, a knock echoed at the door. It wasn't the gentle tap of a polite guest, but a firm, forceful knock that reverberated throughout the apartment. All the laughter and chatter in the room abruptly died out. The air grew thick, an ominous silence descending. Robert, mid-sentence, furrowed his brows, clearly annoyed at the interruption. Isabella also looked towards the door with a puzzled expression. I remained seated, as calm as a statue, a faint, cold smile playing on my lips.
I knew that knock wasn't from the notary Robert had been expecting. It was the knock of destiny, of truth, and of destruction. Robert slowly rose, his eyes full of irritation. He walked towards the door, completely unaware that this door wouldn't open to the bright future he yearned for, but rather a direct path to the abyss. I sat there amidst the boisterous laughter and the fake adulation for Marcus, but my mind was in a very different place.
I clearly visualized every detail of the plan, like a surgeon picturing each incision before a complex operation. Immediately after my call with Julian last night, I didn't hesitate for a second. Using an old burner phone, I sent an encrypted message condensing all the necessary information. It wasn't just the apartment address or a description of my injuries. It was a sharp summary of Marcus Thorne's true nature, a greedy, cruel, and dangerous man. I provided subtle hints about his shady dealings, the suspicious transactions I'd inadvertently witnessed or overheard. I knew Julian wouldn't act alone. He was the state governor, and a man in that position would have a professional, elite investigative team at his disposal. I trusted their efficiency, their ability to turn over every stone and uncover every truth. Marcus, in his expensive suit and complacent smile, was raising a glass of wine, recounting some insipid business deal. He didn't know that even his hearty laughter, the clinking of his glass, was just background noise for the play about to conclude. Victoria, my daughter, sat beside him, her eyes vacant and indifferent, occasionally nodding in agreement. I watched them like two puppets dancing on a stage I had already set. The anger within me was no longer a blazing fire, but a solid, cold block of ice shaping every move. I had moved past the stage of pain and betrayal. Now only focus and an iron will remained. The trap had been set, and Marcus was walking into it with the eagerness of a victor. He thought he was the hunter, but in reality, he was merely the prey.
In the message to Julian, I had emphasized a crucial detail: my medical records, especially the x-rays of my broken arm. A surgeon like me, who had seen thousands of x-rays throughout her career, knew the clear difference between a fracture from a common accident and a defensive fracture.
Marcus's shove wasn't an accident. It was an intentional act of violence, and my fracture was irrefutable proof. I knew Julian's team would find it, analyze it, and turn it into a damning accusation. Additionally, I had mentioned the storage room in the building's basement. It wasn't a normal storage room. Marcus frequently went there, mysteriously, always locking the door and allowing no one near. I had heard strange noises echoing from there, whispered phone calls late at night.
I was certain that was where he kept his dirty secrets, perhaps contraband, forged documents, or anything that could destroy his career and his life. I took a sip of water, feeling a faint metallic taste spread in my mouth. It was the taste of anticipation. I imagined Julian's team at work, following every lead I provided. I saw them examining my x-rays. The images of my broken arm would tell the whole story. I saw them breaking into the basement storage room, searching for incriminating evidence against Marcus. Everything was unfolding silently, invisibly to those reveling upstairs, yet it was as clear as day in my mind. Marcus continued to boast, his voice growing louder, filled with self-satisfaction. He thought he was at the pinnacle of power, that he held everything in his hands.
But he didn't know that every word he uttered, every gesture he made, was being recorded, analyzed, and used to tighten the noose around his neck. The trap had been meticulously laid, every string, every knot, carefully calculated. I felt an unusual calm, a terrifying stillness. He might think he was controlling me, but in reality, he was merely dancing to my tune. The clock on the wall ticked, each second passing slowly but unstoppably.
The hour hand was nearing 8 o'clock, signaling the fated moment. Marcus loudly counted down for the guests, talking about the golden moment when he would sign the apartment sale contract. Just a few more minutes, ladies and gentlemen. 59, 58, he sneered, his eyes darting to me defiantly, as if to say, "You can't do anything, Eleanor." He thought he was counting down to victory, to freedom, and a new life of luxury.
He believed he had complete control over everything, that I had fallen and accepted my fate. But I knew he was counting down to his own doomsday. Every tick of the clock wasn't a signal of his triumph, but a death knell for the illusory empire he had painstakingly built. I looked at him, my gaze serene, without a trace of emotion. I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to do anything. Everything had been arranged. I felt a gentle vibration beneath my feet, an unmistakable sign.
Those were footsteps, footsteps of those who would bring this charade to an end. The doorbell rang, a decisive chime echoing throughout the apartment, cutting through Marcus's laughter and self-satisfaction. He froze, his smile vanishing from his lips, turning his head towards the main door. The game had officially begun. I sat there, feeling each tick of the antique clock on the mantelpiece, a cold countdown. The hour hand had reached exactly 8. A faint smile, almost imperceptible, touched my lips. Marcus and Victoria were still lost in their illusion of victory. He, with a gleeful expression, was telling a stale joke, trying to impress the guests. Forced laughter echoed, but I knew no one truly cared about what he was saying. They were merely puppets in his play, an audience compelled to witness my humiliation. Victoria, sitting opposite, occasionally darted contemptuous glances my way. She was certain I had utterly collapsed, resigned to being stripped of everything. That look, I had seen it before, on the faces of predators. But she didn't know that this prey had set her own trap,
and now was merely waiting for the moment to spring it. My right arm still ached, but the physical pain was overshadowed by a cold serenity, a silent sense of power. I had handed control to Julian, the man I had saved 20 years ago. I knew him to be a man of his word, a man of action.
And I trusted him implicitly. I had provided every detail, every piece of necessary evidence. I had done my part. Now it was Julian's turn. I didn't need to say a word. My silence, my absence from this cheap power game was my greatest strength. I had withdrawn from their stage, allowing them to freely perform their own play. And I knew that play was nearing its climax, an ending they could never foresee. I closed my eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of deceit, of the luxurious dishes wafting from the dinner table. All of it would soon vanish. The very moment the clock chimed 8 times, another sound rang out, strong and decisive, the doorbell. Ding dong! Marcus flinched, then broke into a radiant, triumphant smile. He sprang to his feet, hastily adjusted his suit, and smoothed his hair. It must be the notary, he whispered to Victoria, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Victoria also smiled smugly, glancing at me with utter disdain, as if to say, "You've lost, Eleanor." I remained still, unmoving, not uttering a single word. My heart beat calmly, not a single beat faster. I had waited for this moment, and now it was here. I didn't need to do anything. Everything was already arranged. Marcus strode to the front door, an air of self-satisfaction about him. He opened the door, and his face instantly changed. The smile on his lips vanished, replaced by an expression of utter bewilderment, which quickly morphed into terror. Standing on the threshold was not the elderly notary, but Governor Julian Hayes. He stood there, tall and imposing, with piercing cold eyes, exuding undeniable authority. Behind him was a team of security personnel in black uniforms, fully equipped, guns at the ready, standing rigidly. Light from the hallway streamed in, highlighting their stern faces. The air in the room suddenly grew thick and cold. The murmuring chatter of the guests fell silent. All eyes turned to the door where Marcus stood, stunned, his face ashen. He took a step back, stammering incoherently. Victoria froze, her eyes wide, unable to believe what she was witnessing. The wine glass in her hand trembled. I still sat there, serene as a statue, observing everything unfold. I had left their game a long time ago, and now they were falling into the trap themselves, completely unaware. This room was no longer Marcus's party. It had transformed into my stage, and the main act had just begun. Julian Hayes stepped inside, his gaze sweeping across everyone, pausing for a second on Marcus's pale face, then gliding past a trembling Victoria. Julian's eyes finally settled on me. A slight nod, almost imperceptible, conveyed the clear message, "Everything is going according to plan." I responded with a faint smirk. In this moment, I was no longer the weak, oppressed Eleanor Vance. I was an architect of ruin, a woman silently observing, biding my time. The guests, who had been whispering moments ago, now simply bowed their heads.
"What are you doing here?" he stammered, his voice a pathetic squeak. The smugness had vanished, replaced by sheer terror. Julian didn't answer Marcus immediately. He took a few more steps into the room, his sharp gaze sweeping across the dinner table, then resting on the empty plate in front of me. A heavy silence enveloped the room. Victoria finally found her voice, but it was only a weak whisper. "Mother, what have you done?" She looked at me, her eyes frantic, no longer contemptuous. I simply looked back at her, my eyes empty. Julian slowly turned to Marcus, his gaze seemingly piercing his very soul. He didn't speak loudly, but his deep voice resonated, full of weight. "Marcus Thorne, Julian began. "We're not here for a party, but to discuss your illegal activities." The moment Julian finished speaking, one of the security officers stepped forward, holding up a pair of handcuffs. Marcus looked at the handcuffs, then at Julian, then at me. His face turned ashen. He offered no further resistance. He was caught. I smiled faintly. The play was over. Julian Hayes entered, a cold, authoritative aura filling the room. His eyes sharp and penetrating, swept across the lavish dining table, pausing at the empty plate before me, a plate that should have held a sumptuous meal. But all I'd received in the past 24 hours was contempt and hunger. Then his gaze locked onto my right arm, stark white in its cast, an injury I had endured in silence. A deathly quiet descended, so heavy one could almost hear their own heart pounding. The guests, who moments ago had been laughing freely, now huddled in their chairs, eyes darting nervously, not daring to utter a sound. Marcus stood rooted to the spot, his face drained of color, as white as paper, his mouth agape, but unable to form any sound. Victoria was no better. Her eyes were wide, fixed on Julian, an ultimate terror clearly etched into every feature. I remained motionless, breathing steadily, feeling every cold yet powerful current Julian brought. Deep down, I knew this moment had been destined for a long, long time. Julian said nothing. He advanced toward me, his movements slow and deliberate. Before everyone's eyes, the powerful governor unexpectedly knelt on one knee beside me. He gently placed a bouquet of pristine white roses, their petals still dewy, on the table right next to my empty plate.
It wasn't an apology, but a profound reverence, an acknowledgement of my pain and sacrifice. The gesture was like an invisible knife slicing into Marcus and Victoria's self-satisfaction, making them hold their breath. Julian looked up at me, his eyes filled with compassion and resolve. "Eleanor," he said, his voice deep yet clear and full of authority, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "We have received information. Your x-rays have been reviewed by our specialized medical team." He paused for a moment as if to let his words sink into every corner of the room. "This fracture," Julian continued, emphasizing each word, "is a defensive fracture. Not from a fall, as some have tried to claim. You were assaulted." Julian's final words resonated like a thunderclap, striking Marcus's wildly beating heart. He staggered back, his face completely bloodless. His lies, the elaborate charades he had painstakingly staged, were now laid bare. Marcus recoiled, tripping over the dining chair behind him, creating a jarring sound in the silent room. He struggled to regain his footing, his eyes bloodshot, staring at Julian. "No, that's not it. She fell herself. She slipped, I swear," he shrieked, his voice utterly lost to panic, trying to cling to any fragment of truth he could distort. He pointed at me, his finger trembling. "She's crazy. She wants to harm me. She's old. She's not lucid anymore." Julian Hayes gave him no chance to utter another word. He slowly stood up, his gaze as sharp as a blade. "Mr. Marcus Thorne," Julian said, his voice echoing through the room, carrying the weight of law and justice. "My security team has just completed a search of the basement of this building." He tilted his head slightly, looking directly at Marcus, each word like a bullet piercing through his facade of lies. "And we have discovered a significant quantity of illicit substances carefully hidden. We have clear evidence that this merchandise belongs to you." Julian's words were like a slow-burning bomb, completely shattering Marcus's last hopes. He utterly collapsed. Not a physical fall, but a mental breakdown. He slid to the floor, hands clutching his head, groans escaping his throat. His face now held no trace of arrogance, only utter despair and terror. He was no longer the smug, arrogant man, but merely a coward exposed before everyone, before the guests he had tried so hard to impress. The guests who had been stunned moments ago now began to murmur. Their gazes were no longer curious, but filled with disgust and contempt. They looked at Marcus as one would a trapped animal, completely stripped of the respectable facade he had tried to build. A few people hastily stood up, wanting to leave as quickly as possible, not wishing to be associated with this scandal. Victoria, my daughter, froze, her eyes wide, staring at the cowering Marcus. Her face was ashen, not out of concern for her husband, but out of fear for herself, for the future she had sacrificed everything to obtain. Marcus's party had turned into a party of destruction, and he was the appetizer served before everyone's eyes. I remained seated, calmly observing the chaotic scene, not a single tremor. I had waited for this moment, waited for his downfall, and it was unfolding exactly as I had envisioned. The air in the room was thick with fear and humiliation. Marcus writhed on the floor, repulsive sobs escaping him, trembling like a beaten dog. Victoria stood far from him, her eyes constantly darting between me and Julian Hayes, silently pleading for a glimmer of hope she dared not voice. I felt the shift in power, a cold current running down my spine, confirming that justice had begun to be served. Julian Hayes nodded. 2 officers in dark uniforms approached Marcus, taking hold of him. Marcus struggled weakly, broken pleas spilling out. "No, please, sir, I'm innocent." He tried to reach out to me, but it was too late. My eyes remained cold, impassive. I watched him being led away. Marcus's gaze met mine in that final moment, full of hatred and helplessness. Victoria remained standing there like a statue, watching Marcus's retreating figure disappear. She said nothing, not a single tear, only emptiness and fear enveloping her. The remaining guests hastily departed. Julian Hayes turned to Victoria, his eyes sharp. "Miss Victoria, we need you to come along to clarify some matters related to the concealment of information and possibly complicity." Victoria heard him, her body trembling slightly. I said nothing, just looked into her eyes, the eyes of someone who had chosen her own path and now had to face the consequences. The curtain had fallen. The moment Marcus Thorne collapsed, crumbling at my feet like a puppet with cut strings, I felt no triumph, only emptiness, a chillingly familiar sensation, like standing before a dying patient with no hope of recovery. He who once swaggered and lorded over everyone was now a pathetic mess of tears, sweat, and desperate pleas.
"Eleanor, please, I was wrong. I'll do anything. Please save me from prison," he shrieked, his grimy hands trying to grab my hem, but I skillfully withdrew my foot, maintaining an invisible distance. His voice was filled with fear, a primal terror of losing everything. I stared into his eyes, where the flame of greed once burned, now only a swamp of despair remained. I had seen this scene hundreds of times in the emergency room. The selfish, the loud-mouthed, when faced with death or destruction, all become weak and pathetic. But Marcus's pathetic state didn't touch my heart. It was just part of the final act, a terrible performance by a bad actor. Immediately after, Victoria, my daughter, also collapsed to her knees beside him. Tears streamed down her face, but her eyes held no genuine remorse. It was panic, the fear of losing the luxurious life she had chosen, the fear of being exposed. "Mom, I'm sorry. It's all Marcus's fault. He forced me. He threatened me." She blamed everything on her husband, her voice shrill, trying to pull me to her side with false words. I looked at her, and in that moment, I saw a Victoria I had never known, a Victoria who only thought of herself, ready to sacrifice anyone to protect her facade.
crocodile tears. Did she think I would be fooled by this performance? I had lived long enough to know truth from lies. "Marcus," I said, my voice terrifyingly calm, each word like an iceberg. "You can deceive others, but you cannot deceive me." My gaze was unwavering, devoid of any expression. He cringed as if struck by a lightning bolt. He was no longer the complacent, arrogant man, but merely a coward exposed before everyone. Then I turned to Victoria, my eyes locked onto hers. "Victoria, you stood there. You witnessed me being torn down. You chose silence. You chose a luxurious life beside him. You silenced me. You abandoned me." My words were like daggers piercing straight through my daughter's deceit. Victoria cringed, bowing her head, not daring to meet my gaze. She couldn't face the raw truth I had just exposed. Julian Hayes, who had remained standing with a stern expression, didn't utter a word. He merely nodded subtly, signaling the security team. 2 men in black uniforms immediately stepped forward and handcuffed Marcus. He still shrieked, still pleaded, but his voice was drowned out by the cold click of the handcuffs and the decisive footsteps. He was led away, staggering like a cornered animal. Victoria was also taken away for questioning, though not in handcuffs, but her panicked eyes showed she understood her fate. She cast a final glance at me, a look of resentment, fear, and despair all at once. I didn't respond. I simply stared straight into those eyes, allowing her to see the cold indifference of a mother utterly betrayed. The guests who had witnessed the entire drama from beginning to end hurriedly left in silence. No farewells, no shared glances, just hasty footsteps and fading whispers as they exited the door. They were moths drawn to the flame of power and money, and now, when that light flickered out, they vanished as if they had never existed. The room quickly became empty, leaving only Julian Hayes and me. An indelible shame hung over this apartment, but it was not my shame. It was the shame of Marcus, of Victoria, and of all who had chosen to stand with them. I remained seated, calm as a statue, watching their retreating figures disappear. The satisfaction wasn't triumph, not a noisy sense of victory. It was a release, a profound peace that came from closing a dark chapter in my life. I had observed everything, every minute detail of their downfall from afar, and now everything was over. But I knew this ending was just the beginning of something new. The room became eerily silent, with only the ticking of the wall clock counting down each second to a future I couldn't yet clearly envision. I sighed softly, a breath carrying both weariness and a fragile spark of hope. Could I truly find peace after everything that had happened? The spacious apartment was now steeped in an unnerving stillness, but it wasn't the silence of pain or isolation. It was the stillness of a space that had just been cleansed, like an operating room after a successful surgery, where all the sharp instruments and stains had been cleared away, leaving behind only sterility and the promise of a new beginning. I remained in my worn armchair, my right arm in a cast, rested on the armrest. Julian Hayes gently pulled the opposite chair closer and sat down, his gaze no longer holding the worry or tension of a governor dealing with a crisis, but only profound empathy. "Eleanor," Julian began, his voice deep and warm, piercing the silence without shattering it. "You did very well. Everything will be handled. Marcus Thorne will face charges of elder abuse and drug trafficking. With the evidence we've collected, he'll be in prison for a very long time. As for Victoria, she will have many questions to answer regarding concealing information and potentially complicity. Her career in real estate will likely be over." I nodded slightly, feeling a shiver run down my spine. But this time it wasn't fear. It was a confirmation of justice, of order restored. "Thank you, Julian. You kept your word." I looked around the apartment, my eyes sweeping over each familiar piece of furniture,
each family photo on the shelf.
Once a sanctuary of happiness, then transformed into a prison, it had now returned to its original essence, but carried a deeper meaning. This house, every brick, every memory, had been cleansed of the ghosts of greed and betrayal. I felt an unusual lightness, as if a malignant tumor had just been surgically removed from my life. It was painful, it left scars, but it was necessary for life to continue. Julian smiled faintly, a smile full of understanding.
He didn't need me to say much. He read it all in my eyes. "Do you need anything, Eleanor?" he asked. I thought for a moment, then a small, almost childlike desire suddenly surfaced. It wasn't a grand wish, not a desire for revenge, but a simple, meaningful act marking my return to a normal life. "Julian," I said, my voice a little hoarse, "could you bring me a fork?" Julian was slightly surprised, but only for a moment. His gaze swept across the cluttered dining table, where lavish dishes had been left untouched, and a red velvet cake, still intact, forgotten amidst the chaos. It was the cake I had prepared for Marcus's party, my favorite cake, but I had been denied access to it for the past 24 hours. He understood. He stood up, gently retrieved a fork from the table. The silver fork gleamed under the light, and carefully placed it in my left palm. I held the fork, feeling the coolness of the metal, trembling yet resolute. My right arm still ached, but my left now held a new strength. I slowly extended my left hand, using the fork to cut a piece of the red velvet cake. The smooth white cream cheese frosting, interspersed with the deep red cake layers, was like a symbol of sweetness and wounds. I brought the piece of cake to my mouth, savoring it slowly. The sweet, rich flavor melted on my tongue, not just of the cake, but of freedom, of justice, of reclaiming control over my life. Every grain of sugar, every dollop of cream was a testament to my silent victory. I was no longer a victim. I was Eleanor Vance, a surgeon who had saved many lives, and today I had surgically operated on my own life, excising the malignant tumor that had gnawed at my soul. My broken arm would heal, the bruises on my skin would fade. But the scars on my soul would forever be a reminder of this hard-won lesson. I wasn't weak. I was just waiting for the right moment. I didn't scream. I quietly laid out my plans. I didn't resist with violence. I used intellect and patience to overthrow my enemies. And now that everything was settled, now that justice had been served, I felt a profound peace, a serenity I had lost for too long. I looked at Julian, my eyes filled with boundless gratitude. He was my connection to the outside world, the one who had believed in me and helped me when I was at my weakest. "Thank you, Julian," I repeated. This time my voice was clearer and stronger. "You showed me that there are still good things in this world." He nodded, then stood. "You deserve peace, Eleanor," Julian said. "If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to call me." He left, leaving me alone in the cleansed room. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the cake, the smell of freedom. I was ready for a new chapter of my life, a chapter free of toxicity, filled only with peace and freedom. I would renovate this apartment, turn it into my true sanctuary. I would rediscover old hobbies, reconnect with old friends. I would live a full life, no longer haunted by the shadow of betrayal. I closed my eyes. A gentle smile spread across my lips. Life, once again, was in the palm of my hand. And this time, I wouldn't let anyone take it away from me again.